All right, today we're jumping into a report that asks a massive, multi-billion-dollar question about healthcare funding, specifically in New York. It's a story about a system the source actually calls a federal ATM, and trust me, it has implications for taxpayers all across the country. So, the report we're looking at, it kicks things off with this really provocative claim, calling New York's healthcare system a federal ATM. I mean, that's a bold way to start, right? It immediately frames the core issue, a system that, it's alleged, allows for super easy withdrawals of federal cash with very little oversight. And look, this isn't just some catchy phrase they threw out there. The source points to auditors who found a staggering $17.2 billion in what they call improper Medicaid payments and questionable deals, all in a single year. That's the headline number that really sets the stage for this whole thing. Okay, so you're probably asking, how on earth is a number that big even possible? Well, according to this report, it all comes down to the really unique way New York's system is set up, especially when you compare it to how most other states do things. And this is really where you see the key difference. On the left, you've got the standard model for Affordable Care Act money, a direct line from the feds to individual people, all tracked by agencies like the IRS. But then you look at the right. That's New York's pass-through model. The federal government just sends this giant lump sum check to the state, and then the state is in charge of handing out the money. So what's the magic key that lets this happen? It's something called a Section 1332 waiver. You can think of it as the legal permission slip that unlocks this whole pass-through system. It basically allows the federal government to write that massive check based on the enrollment numbers that New York itself provides. The report uses some really vivid language to describe what this system creates. They call it a black box and say it throws a layer of fog over everything. The point they're making is pretty clear. This structure makes it incredibly tough for anyone, especially federal taxpayers, to trace exactly where their dollars are ending up on an individual level. All right, so we've got this unique system, and the report says it's not very transparent. So what? What's the fallout from all this? Now, let's follow the money to see the kind of financial incentives and, well, outcomes this system allegedly creates. And this really breaks down the core argument step by step. The logic they present is pretty straightforward. First, the state reports how many people are enrolled. Second, the size of that giant federal check is directly tied to those numbers, which leads to the crucial third step. This setup creates what the source calls a massive financial incentive to keep those enrollment lists as full as possible, whether or not everyone on that list is actually eligible. And they don't just leave it at that, they put a number to it. The claim is that as many as 3 million people who are supposedly ineligible are still on the state's books. And, according to the report's logic, as long as those names are there, that federal check stays nice and big. Okay, and this is where the story gets really weird. I mean, you usually hear about government programs running out of money, right? Not having too much. But the source points out this huge paradox. Because of this system, New York's Essential Plan Trust Fund was on a path to have an $8.9 billion surplus by 2025. It really makes you ask, why was the program taking in so much more federal money than it was actually paying out? All right, so that's the picture the report paints of what's happening in New York. But you might be thinking, why should I care about one state's system? Well, because it's funded with federal tax dollars, this story connects directly to the national budget and, yeah, ultimately to your wallet. This chart really brings the national debt down to a personal level. Think about it. For every single dollar you pay in federal income tax, the source points out that a chunk of it, about 20 cents, doesn't go to roads or schools or defense. It goes to pay for one thing: interest on the national debt. And anytime there's potential waste in a federal program, it just adds to that growing debt pile. And just to give you some perspective on the national scale here, the report notes that roughly 6.6% of the whole U.S. population gets subsidies through the Affordable Care Act. It's a really significant program, so how every one of those dollars is managed has a ripple effect across the entire country. Now, there was also a really big policy change that played a role here. The report explains that during the COVID era, they actually removed the income cap for these subsidies entirely. That, of course, dramatically expanded the program's reach and the total amount of federal spending. You know, to really get your head around the kind of spending we're talking about today, it's pretty eye-opening to take a step back in time. Let's put today's numbers into some historical context and look at a federal budget from not too long ago. And here's a pretty wild fact from the report. Fiscal year 1995 was apparently the last time the U.S. passed a budget the old-fashioned way, what they call regular order, where all the spending bills get passed one by one on time. Ever since then, it's basically been an era of stopgap measures and emergency resolutions. And this comparison, wow, it really puts things in perspective. Back in 1995, the entire federal budget was about $1.5 trillion. Fast forward to 2024, and it's over $6 trillion. Just look at the interest on the debt in 95, $232 billion. That number seems almost quaint compared to the scale of spending and borrowing we see today. And all of this brings us back to the big, nagging question at the very heart of this report. If you have a system, like the one described in New York, that doesn't have that direct line of sight from the federal government, who's actually on the hook? Who is ultimately accountable for how every single one of those tax dollars gets spent? It's a multi-billion-dollar question that's definitely worth thinking about.